much for inviting me. It's a real treat and a pleasure, and a wonderful opportunity to time travel away from the rainy environment that I'm sitting in right here in Britain to talk to you. So I want to talk a bit about, as Gabriel said, cookbooks is history and how we can try to read cookbooks as historical sources. So I want to start with a quote from a wonderful book by a historian called Janet Theophano. So if we could go to the next slide. She commented, "There is much to be learned from reading cookbooks besides how to prepare food." So what I'd like to talk about very briefly today is a bit about the history of cookbooks themselves and about some of the things that we can learn from them, and particularly how we can try to learn from the cookbooks that we possess something about the history of our own families. So I want to start with a very brief history of cookery books. So you very briefly flashed up actually the answer to the question. I'm curious, does anybody have a guess where the oldest cookery book in the world is from, or from how long ago it is? Any guesses at all from anyone? I don't know if Gabriel, if there are ways that people can put it in the chat or whether people can raise their hands. Somebody said Egyptian times. Not bad as a guess. So here we can have the answer on the correct slide. The oldest known cookery book is a set of 3 cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia from 1750 BC. And these cuneiform tablets contain 25 recipes for stews. So yeah, not a bad guess. And the recipes list the ingredients and the order in which they should be added, but it says nothing about the measures, the cooking times, what you do with the ingredients. So clearly they were aimed at experienced chefs. They're not recipes to tell you how to make something that you didn't know how to make already. They're sort of reminders of how to prepare something that you kind of already know. And one of the key factors bridging cuneiform tablets like this one from millennia ago and today's cookery books is the printing press. So maybe we could have the next slide, because that's the printing press is really what takes us from these ancient cookery books to the things we know today. Because prior to the invention of movable type, which was invented in China in the 11th century and in the West in the 1450s, before that, cookbooks, like all books, were handwritten and they were not aimed at a wide audience. Handwritten cookery books first started to appear in China as long ago as the 2nd century BC. Then they started to appear in the Arab world around the 10th century BC. We have several from Baghdad, for example, and in Europe, perhaps from about the 12th century. So if we go to the next slide, for example, you can see several typical European manuscript cookery books. On one side, you can see a Catalan one, a health manual and cookbook. And on the other side, you can see one of the earliest English cookery books called The Form of Curry, which sadly has nothing to do with the well-known Indian stew. Curry coming from the Old French word related to cuisine for cooking, for the same word that gives us cuisine is the same that gives us curry. And so if we look at the next slide, for example, here's an example of a recipe from the Form of Curry for something called a toasty, a little bit like a bit of toasted bread. You can see at the bottom, you can see the actual medieval writing where it says toasty in red across the top, but it explains that you take some wine and honey and mix it together and add some spices, and then you toast some bread and pour this sweetened wine over the toast and eat it. So it's a sort of piece of, well, not exactly French toast, but, you know, wine, sweetened wine-laden bread. Now, it's the printing press that allowed cookery books to move from being these handwritten, locally circulated, small numbers of things to being the sorts of things that can reach the wide audience that we know today. And from the 18th century, the number of printed cookery books grew and grew. So if we go to the next slide, for example, you can see a typical 18th century cookery book, this one by the proprietor of a well-known London tavern. There are examples from the the early independent US. So there's some cookery books produced in the 1790s that are printed and are published. One of the earliest ones is, describes itself very proudly as being published by an American. And from the 19th century, cookbooks began also to be printed to accompany the growing numbers of new domestic appliances, such as ice boxes, or by the 20th century, refrigerators that industrialization created. And some of you may possess cookbooks like this that were written, cookbooks written to go with a new piece of domestic kit, whether it's a new juicer, a microwave, a spiralizer. You can now get cookery books that are aimed specifically at telling you how to use these new devices. And the manufacturers of the new packaged industrialized foodstuffs that also began to appear in increasing numbers from the 19th century, those manufacturers also began to publish cookery books to teach cooks how to use their products. So on the next slide, for example, you can see some examples of a cookery book to tell you how to use a slow cooker. I could have used an example of an Instapot, a recipe book telling you how to use packaged beef suet, a recipe card from a supermarket, because the new supermarkets that began also to emerge in the 20th century also began to produce cookery books and recipe cards. So industrialization created new forms of cookbook, but at the same time, the appearance of printed cookbooks didn't lead to the demise of handwritten cookery books. And many of us possess collections of recipes assembled by our usually female relatives. Often these combine handwritten recipes with recipes scissored out of a newspaper or torn from a magazine or pasted in from the sides of cereal boxes or bags of sugar. If we look at the next slide, we can see many examples of all sorts of handwritten recipe books, handwritten recipes. And indeed, these days, when many of us get our recipes online, lots of online sites allow you to curate your own virtual cookbook by saving your own favorite online recipes into what's often called a recipe box. So the format of the recipe box lives on even online. But what can all this tell us about the past? Maybe there's a slide that says, what can this tell us about the past? If we go to the next one, maybe. So what can we learn from all these cookery books? Oh, we can learn an enormous amount from cookery books. But before I talk about that, I want to say a little bit about two of the really distinctive features of how we relate to cookery books, how we read them. And the first thing is that we read them in a really distinctive way. We don't tend to read cookery books the same way that we read novels. We don't read them from start to finish. You don't start on the first page and work your way through to the index at the very end. We read cookbooks more like we read newspapers or TV guides. That's to say, there isn't any single correct order in which you have to read them. You can flip back and forth, you can move all the way through. Scholars often call these sorts of works, things that you read in this back and forth way, a discourse colony. You can go to the next slide. I think I've put that on a slide. So I think this is an idea that that these cookbooks are like an archipelago of little bits, recipe here, a recipe there, and you can weave your way through them in any order you want. Moreover, people rarely read, let alone cook, all the recipes in a single cookery book, and we think that's absolutely fine, right? You don't have to read it all, you don't have to cook it all, you don't have to finish it all. So this is one distinctive thing, that we're quite free and easy with how we read cookery books. The second thing that I think is distinctive, maybe we can go to the next slide, is that they are what historians sometimes call highly interactive. We feel absolutely free to personalize them with annotations, with comments. We stick in clippings of other things, we scribble things out, we write too salty or more butter in the margins. And so because we do all of this, we annotate them, we stick things in, we tear out recipes that look similar from other places and interleaf them with our cookbooks. All of that helps to make a cookbook into a sort of archive of the owner's life. So the cookbook accumulates bits and pieces from our lives. that we stick in there. I found a very interesting 18th century example of this in the Harvard archives. Harvard University has a really good collection of cookery books. And I was looking through an 18th century cookery book that had stuffed in it a loose sheet of paper, these books often do, that had a recipe copied onto one side of it. And the other side was reusing a piece of paper that had been originally a letter. So on the one side was the recipe, and that was why this was being kept. On the other side was a letter, a bit of a letter. And so I could read a bit of the letter. I turned it over. On the back, there was this drama that was being played out on the letter. And it said it was torn, so I didn't have the whole letter. But it said something like something, Papa's opposition to my marriage, something, he will never forgive, something. And it went on like this for some time. And it concluded, burn this. But the writer hadn't burnt it. They'd used it to copy out a recipe for pickled pork on the other side, and they'd stuffed it in a cookery book. And then 200 years later, there I was reading it. So all sorts of things that have nothing to do with cooking accumulate in our cookery books. And I think we'll see this if you look at the flip sides of things that you've stuffed into your cookery books. You'll find bits of newspaper from 1972, all sorts of things. So these are two features of how we read cookery books. We read them in this interactive way, and we don't read them from start to finish. But let's think a little bit more then about how to read a cookbook. What can we learn from these different types of reading? Well, the food scholar Barbara Wheaton has suggested 5 different ways of reading a cookbook, each of which sheds light, oh, there we are, fantastic, on different ways to learn something from it. So she says, first of all, you can read a cookbook to study the ingredients. So here, for example, we have 2 different recipes. One is an 18th century recipe for how to make potato cakes. So what can we learn from that? We can learn something about the spread of potatoes. This is an English recipe. Potatoes are from Peru, and there's a whole history of how potatoes got from Peru to Europe. And so you can look at the emergence of certain ingredients and say, okay, we can trace the presence now of a new food, potatoes perhaps in Europe. Or on the other side, you can see a recipe from Yotam Ottolenghi, who writes in the New York Times and produces recipes. And here we can see he includes all sorts of things, including something called za'atar, something else called sumac, spices that have now become somewhat more familiar, and we can trace the presence of new, fashionable, trendy spices by looking at today's recipes. So we can study the ingredients and learn something about what ingredients were popular. We can look at the rise and fall of Jell-O or other things as features that we study. One way to read a cookbook. Another way to read a cookbook, if we go to the next slide, is you can read it to find out what does it tell us about the kitchen. And what sorts of cooking methods and equipment does the cook have? Do you need an open fire or a spiralizer to make the ingredients? Is it indeed a recipe, a cookbook made to accompany a new piece of kitchen equipment, like a bread maker or a fridge freezer? What sorts of things does the cookbook tell us about the accoutrements of the kitchen in which the cook was operating? Or, to go to another slide, we can read to try to find out something about the meals that the recipes are intended to create. Not just individual recipes, but what kinds of meals were people eating at the time. So here's a little extract from a cookbook from the 1500s that has some menu plans in it. And it has a menu plan here for what you serve on fish days. That's to say, days when you were fasting and needed not to eat meat. So we can learn something about the larger meals that people consumed from cookbooks. And lots of cookbooks will give you suggestions of meals, how to combine these ingredients into a meal. And so we can learn something about how people ate and about the social life of the people who might have been eating these foods. Another way is, if we go to the next slide, you can try to find the voice of the author, the voice of the publisher, the voice of the reader. So cookery books have different voices. Nigella Lawson has a different sound, for example, than does Julia Child. So if you think of the voice of the author as something that comes across, you can get some, some sense of the person who wrote the cookbook. I think if we go to the next slide, you can see something of my grandmother's voice. There's my grandmother. Here's her recipe for apricot cookies. And you can see at the bottom, she's written, eat in moderate amounts. So I think you get some sense, you get a little sense of the personality of the author of the cookbook from listening to their voice, hearing how they talk in the cookery book. And finally, the fifth way, if we go to the next slide, of reading a cookbook is you can treat the book as a physical object. Is it stained? Is it annotated? Is it heavy and glossy? Is it small and cheap? Are the pages bent and stained? Which were the most popular recipes? You can usually tell right away because the cookery book will open to those pages. So, Sundays at the Moosewood Restaurant. Yeah, I grew up in Ithaca. I grew up in the town of Moosewood Restaurant. So that's a very important recipe book for me. So you can try to read the cookery book in that way, as something that tells you as a physical object and that tells you about how it was used. So these are some ways to read a cookbook, but what can we learn? What more can we learn? I want to push this a little bit more. I want to particularly focus on what we can learn about the lives of ordinary people from reading cookery books, because scholars are always on the lookout for new sources, new ways to make sense of the lives of ordinary people, and particularly ordinary women. I mean, as we all know, women left fewer written records than men. And so finding places where we can recapture the voices of women in the past, perhaps our ancestors, our relatives, our great-grandmothers, is something that we can turn to the cookery book to try to do. And so I want to say a bit about how to do that. And I have already mentioned the word Janet Theophano, whose words I quoted at the very beginning of this lecture. And so Janet Theophano commented that for hundreds of years, women of diverse backgrounds have found the homely cookbook as a suitable place to record their stories and thoughts, as well as their recipes. And she writes, the cookbook, like the diary and the journal, evokes a universe inhabited by women, both in harmony and in tension with their families, their communities, and their larger social world. So, for instance, cookbooks can reveal the networks of friendship and family that shaped the lives of the woman or women who owned the cookbook. And sharing recipes is a really good example. Sharing a recipe is a sign of a relationship. It's perhaps even a sign of trust. And so, for example, manuscript cookbooks from hundreds of years ago, even those that are compiled by a single woman, often include recipes that have names like Mrs. Smith's excellent way to make a cake, or my neighbor Margaret's best way to preserve red currants, or whatever. So even cookery books that are assembled by a single woman often include recipes that she's got from her friends and relatives and neighbors. And so these exchanges of recipes map out a network of associations between that woman and other people. They can even help us establish personal genealogies. If we think of our own collections, we might have, Auntie Hilda's recipe for chocolate chip cookies, etc. So we can think of our collections of recipes as a little map of our relationships with our relatives, particularly our women relatives. So we could try to think of cookbooks as collaborative, often feminine ventures. So in the interest of time, we'll skip maybe the next slide and go on to the next one. We skip and go to the next. I want to say something even more than looking at cookbooks as places where we can trace out connections and the networks of friendship and family of ourselves or our relatives in the past. We can also try to look at cookbooks as literary texts, as something that we might analyze the same way that you might analyze a novel. So that seems sort of surprising. I mean, it seems surprising that we might use the same techniques that we use to analyze a poem or a novel to analyze a cookbook, but I think we can. So for example, we can think about the setting of a cookbook. Does the cookery book have drawings or photographs of a particular place? Does it refer to particular venues? Is it a cookbook of Italian food? That gives us a setting. Is it a cookbook that has recipes from, well, for example, the Moosewood restaurant, as was mentioned in the chat? That takes you to a setting. Are there photographs, etc.? So you can think about whether there's a setting for your cookbook. You can think about voice, as I was already suggesting. You can hear, what's the voice of the author? Is it Nigella Lawson? How is she talking? How is she writing? What sorts of voices do we hear? The same way that you might look for the voice of a narrator in a novel. Does it have characters? Does the cookery book have characters? Are there anecdotes about the people whose recipes are described? Are there stories about so-and-so who gave me this recipe? Cookery books often do this. They will say, oh, I got this recipe from this wonderful chef I met in this village in southern Italy in my Italian cookbook, etc. So you can look for characters. And then finally, you can even think of a plot, which, and that might seem really surprising. I mean, the idea that a cookery book has a plot seems, again, possibly far-fetched. I want to try to sketch that out a little bit. And there's a food scholar called Anne Bauer who's made an argument about there being a number of different plots that you can study in, for example, 19th and 20th century US cookery books. So if we go to the next slide, she argues that there are a number of different plots. She says there's what she calls, for example, the historical plot. So a historical plot, for example, uses food to narrate a historical event. So the cookbook might be arranged chronologically. It might include factual details about an event. It might have photographs or information about historical figures. It might link recipes to particular historical events. If you go to the next slide, you can see something that's an example of, for example, a historical plot cookbook. So here's a World War II themed cookery book, Nostalgic Food and Facts from 1940 to 1945. So you can think about this cookbook as actually having a historical plot. Or, for example, another sort of plot that Anne Bauer talks about is what she calls the differentiation plot. Well, this is a plot where the cookbook celebrates the distinctive culture of the people responsible for the recipes. So yeah, there we go. We have an example of, so the distinctive culture might be ethnic, it might be religious, it might be geographic, it might be associational, it might be, and indeed, as the slide indicates, there's a whole genre of what are called gay cookbooks, which are telling a story of distinctiveness about a particular culture. So we can think of lots of different cookery books that might be telling a differentiation story about our food and how our food is distinct and special. And there's a we, there's an us who have this food. One of the places we can see these plots really clearly, I think, is in so-called community cookbooks. These are the collaborative efforts wherein people offer recipes to create a cookbook. Many of us might have contributed a recipe to such a venture, usually to fundraise for something, for a church, for a school, for a synagogue. There are thousands of such books, and they usually follow one of these plots. And scholars have sometimes described these community cookbooks as community autobiographies. It's notable they're usually compiled by women, and they record the stories that the authors, the women who compile these cookbooks, tell about themselves. Even more than that, I think we can see these community cookbooks, these collaborative fundraising cookbooks, as places where women often engaged in politics or expressed their moral and ideological convictions. That's insofar as these cookery books were usually aimed at raising money for a cause. They provided an opportunity for women, particularly in the past, to have a public voice and to get involved in raising money for causes, making their moral or ideological or political convictions clear, whether it was fundraising, as I said, for a particular religious institution or for a temperance society, or for any number of other causes. And as Anne Bauer again commented, while few women had a public voice in the 19th century. Few women had a public voice in running the major institutions of 19th century society. Their voices were heard, at least to some extent, when they participated in community cookbooks. And indeed, scholars have sometimes argued that compiling these cookbooks is an example of what they call politicized domesticity. So using the domestic space that women were considered to be at home in as a way of intervening in political and social debates. So to try to conclude, to try to pull this a bit together and give us an opportunity to talk about your cookbooks, I've tried to suggest that cookbooks can be useful historical sources in a number, that's fine, I can say that, in a number of different ways. So cookbooks can tell us something about real and aspirational eating practices. They can tell us something about ingredients, about the cooking technologies that were around at the time the cookbook was produced. They can tell us something about the ideas of health. But beyond all of that, we can think of them as what scholars sometimes call ego documents, as forms of autobiographical life writing, as places where women especially recorded aspects of their lives. And as Linda Murray Berzok wrote, and as Gabriel was quoting at the beginning, as she wrote, some women left diaries. My mother left recipes. And that's a form of a diary. We might think of cookery books as a form of some kind of diary. Whether the cookery book is a handwritten notebook passed down through generations or a stained and annotated copy of The Joy of Cooking, these books reveal something about family history, about everyday life, and about the realities and experiences of particularly women in the past. The feminist scholar Patrocinio Schweikart, who's quoted here, has argued that to read a text and then to write about it is to connect not only to the author of that text, but to a community of readers. So he argues that reading something connects you to all the other people who might be reading that same book. I think you could maybe make the same argument about cooking a recipe. Maybe when we cook a recipe, we're connecting to all the other people who have cooked that recipe in the past or in the present or in the future, forming part of a whole community. Perhaps we're participating in a recipe event. So maybe when we read a cookbook and cook a recipe, we're not just looking for a recipe, but we're also connecting to a community of cooks and readers, past, present, and future. Thank you very much.
Well, I was just wondering, it seems as I think about it, if people are indeed just collecting recipes from the internet and sticking them in a file, that it's not nearly as interesting or nearly as enlightening maybe as an actual book. Even I suppose they could still annotate the recipes, but it just doesn't seem as special as having a book. So I wondered if we're losing something, if people are mostly getting the recipes from the internet now.
Well, there seems to be some nodding at that, and I agree. I mean, I think that there's the longevity of things on the internet is sort of, it's untested. I mean, many of us will remember pieces of computer technology that are now unreadable, and forms of discs that we've saved things on that we now don't have the machines that we can read anymore, etc. So what will happen to those curated collections of things we've saved to an online recipe box? It's a very good question, and whether those will be things that will be accessible by the next generation, really remains to be seen. So it's very convenient, but it perhaps also loses something of this sense of connection that we get from having these physical copies. That
right, even my grandmother's handwriting on a recipe I have, and I remember that handwriting from when I was a kid, and she wrote letters to me. So it's more meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about these things. They're not just, and a cookbook isn't just a set of instructions on how to make a recipe. They're physical objects, and physical objects are full of memories. Or I mean, they can be. Physical objects can be this place where our memories of other people adhere and crystallize in exactly the way that you're describing. I think the handwriting is really powerful.
Well, I just wanted to brag a little, even though I did not make this myself. But years ago, my family on my dad's side had one reunion, and we haven't had one since. And it was June of 2011. And a cousin of mine put together this computerized cookbook with pictures. And this is the only picture of all the cousins and at the time, my one living aunt, and she has passed, and a few of the cousins have passed since then. But inside, she asked for everybody's, suggestions from the family, and she put the names and she incorporated the recipes. And as you can see, we go back a long time. So, we have the great grandparents in there, and it's a treasure. And I haven't even used all these cookbooks. I mean, all these recipes, but this was a labor of love. And then the other one I have, my mother was a teacher. So wouldn't you know, she took this composition book and she created in her handwriting. Anytime I see her handwriting, you can't really see it too well, but everything was handwritten. I mean, yeah, she had cutouts from magazines and stuff, but the important recipes were all handwritten. In fact, there's one for rice pudding that I wanted to make this weekend, for Shavuot, just because it's dairy. So, everybody holds on to things, and these are treasures that I hold on to.
I think that's a really, really good example of how a cookbook can be a way of telling a family history. And as you said, it's not about whether you cook the recipes or not. I mean, in some ways, it has this very powerful way of conveying a sense of family that I think we all felt when we saw this. And the idea that these people are then connected to a particular set of recipes or things that are associated with them tells a story about them. Again, that shows that cookery books they're not just instruction manuals. They're not just like, the how to use some new piece of technology that you get. They're about stories. And that's really interesting. And it's very interesting that both of you are mentioning the handwriting as a powerful place that conjures up particular individuals. I think that's a really striking feature of the cookbook. Have other people got interesting cookbooks? Or, yeah, I can see it. Pat, I can see you.
Yes, I actually a few Christmases ago, I put together a little, what's probably like a chapter of a book that is recipes from generations of German grandmothers. And I have 7 granddaughters, so I made a copy for each of them. And I also made a copy for my 3 children. And I find, and this is in line with the comments about computer, I find that my children have commented more on the recipes than my grandchildren. I don't think the grandchildren have done very much with them, but I think, there are lots of mostly Christmas kinds of things in here. And so I don't know whether it's something my granddaughters will keep and use eventually, or whether I just need to make a flash drive for them.
Well, I mentioned that the Harvard University Library has a really, really good collection of cookbooks. And it's connected to what I was saying before about there being a particular power of cookbooks to be telling stories about women's lives. I should say it's not exactly a Harvard library. It's the Radcliffe Library, which is the single sex version of Harvard before they went co-ed all those years ago. And so the Schlesinger Library does collect cookbooks. So I don't know what they want in particular, but if people have really unusual cookbooks that you want to do something with, you can always get in touch with the Schlesinger Library.
I was just wondering, when somebody mentioned Moosewood, Sundays at Moosewood, I went back to my Molly Katzen, my original version of her cookbook. And then I just read about her that she was actually the director at Harvard for a few years of some library like that or something. I forgot what I read already, but something that she was involved with Harvard for about 10 years. So is she, but she's not listed in the collective that wrote the Sundays at Moosewood cookbook. Can anybody explain that?
I have a feeling, so I didn't know she had a connection to Harvard. I have a feeling there was some kind of parting of the ways between Molly Katzen and the Moosewood at a certain point. So various people are nodding at that. I don't know if anybody can elaborate more on that than I can.
No.
No, but yeah, I think I think she went off to California at a certain point.
Even the later edition of Moosewood, I have both of them. She's listed in Berkeley, so she went off and she's doing other things.
Yeah, so I have my mother's 1942 Good Housekeeping cookbook. And as Rebecca mentioned, I mean, it's full of things torn out of newspapers. Sometimes the date's still on them. So that meant a lot to me too. And lots of things in her own handwriting. And she died in 1990. And I wouldn't take anything for this book. I mean, it's just, I feel so grateful that I still have it. It's kind of falling apart, and I've thought about maybe having it rebound so that it would, maybe one of my nieces or something would like it. I don't know, but it just means so much to me. And I mentioned about it suggests substitutions that for things that were hard to get or that you didn't have the budget for. And this was during the war. So, you know, it talks about substitutions that were very interesting. And one other thing I really liked about it, I'm a retired librarian, and one of the things it mentioned is use the index. The index will help you. So I got a kick out of that. Thanks so much. I love this talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's interesting to think there is exactly as you said about what does the cookbook tell us about the context of when it was written? And so the substitutions in the war is a really good example. I see somebody in the chat who said they have a cookbook recipe from Holocaust survivors. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, someone gave me that book. I haven't used it, but it is a book exclusively of recipes from women who survived the Holocaust.
Do the recipes concentrate in particular areas? I mean, are there recipes from a full spectrum of different types of foods, or are there certain things that they're more of?
Well, I can't tell you that off the bat. I'd have to go get it. So give me a minute and I'll try to find it.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, I know that, I mean, so I'm not a scholar of the Holocaust, but I have a colleague who is, and who's commented about the sort of, the accounts from survivors sometimes talk about how everybody talked about food, you know, so much people were so hungry. That was what, you know, you really talked about, but that at other times people would say, well, you stop talking about food. It's intolerable. It's unbearable. I don't want to think about this anymore. And so I would be curious whether the recipes, you know, congregated into particular types of particularly desired and longed for dishes or span the spectrum. But I'll wait till she's back.
I have so many, but this is 1943, the Settlement Cookbook. I haven't used one recipe from it. I just have it in my collection. It was my mother's. So, you know, the recipes are hysterical if I read them, you know, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And then on the back of the big book that I showed you, a computerized thing, has a picture of our grandparents, because this was a cousin's reunion. And my cousin wrote L'Adore Vador, from generation to generation. So I know she did a fantastic job on this, and I don't know if she'll ever do it again, but it really was a labor of love. So I just wanted to share. I'm very proud of her accomplishment. So
I'll just add that I actually have that settlement cookbook also. It was my mother's. I think she got it. I think the notation in that book is my first recipe book when she got married and picked it up like at a dime store or something. And so there you have a little, annotation in the book with a little history as well.
Who else has a cookbook that's,
Oh, this is the Holocaust.
tell us.
And like I said, it's stories of people from the Holocaust, and it has survivors of the Holocaust, I'm sorry. And it talks, and it's basically a lot of traditional recipes like kugels and things like that. So, like I said, I haven't paid much attention, but this is the book.
That's interesting. Was it produced under the auspices of a particular organization?
I'll get back to you on that one, okay?
Yeah, interesting.
So a little bit in vain with what Freddie was showing us, I have a cookbook that my aunt's, I think a couple of her granddaughters put together.
Wow.
On her first yard site. So there's pictures of her, including when she was trying to give up smoking cigarettes. There's a picture of her smoking her famous pipe. But we were talking about annotations. And so for Rosh Hashanah, for the apple charlotte, she has notes like don't melt the margarine and switch the amounts of flour and so on. So that's kind of fun. But when I came back from Australia, a friend there and I were going to switch cookbooks and so on. Unfortunately, I never got hers, but I bought this one. It's called the Heritage Cookbook. And it's both a cookbook and a history of the United States because it has recipes from the different times in our history. And it starts back in colonial times. I actually make that pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving, but it's a combination of a history book and a cookbook that reminded me of what you were saying about what cookbooks can teach us. So this is both. It was kind of fun.
Yeah, that would be an example, I guess, of a history plot cookbook.
Yes.
And, I mean, so it is really interesting the way one can trace out the movements of people in subtle aspects of recipes. I mean, I have various recipes from the same grandmother that I showed you who was telling people to eat her apricot cookies in moderate amounts. And so when she and my grandfather, oh, look, there we are.
Like her smoking her pipe.
Fantastic. That's just fantastic. Yeah, when my grandparents, when they left Austria in 38, and the recipes, their handwritten recipes, trace out their sort of integration into the new culture of the US, that the recipes start out being in German and the measurements start out being in metric, and then over time the recipes start to be in English, but the measurements are still in metric, and then bit by bit the metric measurements get changed into cups, and the ingredients get transformed into more US-based ingredients. So you can sort of trace out the way in which their familiarity with the new culture manifested itself in this very mundane way in which they recorded that. How did they think about recipes? Did they think in German and in milligrams, or did they think in English and in cups? So even the very mundane things like the units of measure can help you trace out these family histories.
Yeah, some of my mother's recipes are still in German. So, yeah.
That's neat.
I have a friend who translated her mother's recipe from German for me. So I have that in my collection too. But I picked up cookbooks all along our travels. So we have cookbooks from all over the world, and mostly Europe, but it's really fun to go back and look at those also.
And Pat had a comment about community cookbooks often have multiple recipes for the same dish. For example, one German community cookbook has 8 recipes for Lubkuchen from a town of about 800. So an interesting tidbit there, and the differences, even within small communities.
At Temple Emmanuel Sisterhood, Pam will laugh about this, but we created a cookbook years ago, and we asked for any temple member to donate recipes. Well, we got so many recipes, let's say for pot roast or whatever. We couldn't put them all in the cookbook, and we didn't want to make people feel bad if their recipe didn't get in. So we didn't put the names of the people right underneath their recipe. We just picked, I don't know who did it, but we just picked like maybe 3 pot roast recipes, and the rest we couldn't put in. But I felt bad that people didn't get credit for their own recipe, because when you look at the cookbook, you want to know who made that, you know, you want to tie in, you make a connection. So
I really agree. I think having your name in it is that's a really striking feature of these cookbooks. And I think it's also really interesting. What are the things that people get tons of recipes for? So I mean, like this one I was mentioning, the 8 different recipes for this kind of biscuit. And I've got a cookbook from a kind of women's institute from Scotland from the 1930s. And I mean, it has millions of recipes for various things with oatmeal, for example. There are just tons of things involving oatmeal. And I edited a cookbook of students at the university where I teach a couple of years ago, and we got zillions of recipes for cheesecake. I mean, that seemed to be the thing that students were making about 5 years ago. And so it's really sort of striking, or a particular moment when pot roast is what you get a lot of. So again, that tells you something, not necessarily about what people are eating, but what they think of as kind of, their most important recipe, or the most shareable recipe, or the recipe that somehow reflects who they are and what they want to be represented by in a cookbook. So, you put them at that's sort of, yeah, it's really, that's interesting about the importance of names.
I was co-editor of a cookbook for our temple in like 1977. And we actually we had a contest. We invited everyone to bring their prepared recipes that they were submitting. And then we had, for each category, we've had people vote. And whichever recipe won in that category got a special star by it in the cookbook. And and we said what that represented. So that was kind of a fun way that brought everyone together and drummed up interest in the cookbook and in submitting recipes. And since then, there has been a reprint of that version of the cookbook that we added a couple of special sections and separated out like Passover recipes, and we put in a better index. But then just recently, in the past year, they put out a 3rd edition of that cookbook. This is in Tallahassee, Florida. And it's a whole new cookbook almost, but it's such a history of the temple. It's really great. And it has a few recipes from the earlier versions.
I think that gives me an idea to suggest for our sisterhood, when we have our live events again, we should all have a sharing of our family or historical cookbook, kind of session.
That would be great. That would be wonderful.
That's a good idea. I have to touch base with my mother. She's very practical, and it wouldn't surprise me if she's already given away her cookbooks. I mean, I'm kind of vaguely, that would be a shame. Really would be, but she's been cleaning a lot.
Like baseball cards, when parents give away baseball cards and then their kids are regretting it later on. But
oh, that's right. I would regret it.
My husband still has his. I don't know how he managed to escape his house with them, but he did. But anyway, I have some other books. I mean, I'm not such a great cook, so I only use a couple of my cookbooks, even though I have many of them. But when I taught history, I thought it was interesting, like Cooking of the West, Recipes and Remedies at least 100 years old. Take Two and Butter Them While They're Hot, Heirloom Recipes and Kitchen Wisdom. And then a book on historic cookery, mostly recipes that reflect Mexican cooking or Tex-Mex cooking. But I thought those were kind of interesting. I don't cook from them, but sometimes I just read them because they're interesting.
Another thing from here in Denver, it's the mile high recipes, the ones, the high altitude, particularly with baking. And there are cookbooks that are focus on that. Entire cookbooks give you recipes for at altitude.
I'm just seeing a couple things here. Pat, thanks for all the interesting tidbits. Mentioned that you have a 1955 Good Housekeeping book, and it's interesting to see subsequent editions of the same book and how it changes.
So I have two. This one's called In Mama's House. It was from 1970. I think my mom was very involved in Jewish life in Los Angeles, and it was hers. And you know, you were talking about the stains and all the things. So this definitely, I can tell which recipes for the holidays were her most favorite. And I believe she gave that to me many years ago when I got married, and passed that one down. And then this one is my most recent one. It's called From Terry's Kitchen, and it's a childhood friend who passed away. Her best friend compiled all her favorite recipes, and you talked about, you know, the handwriting and all that evokes. And so when it brought me to tears when I received it. It had so much meaning, and it's just a really special memory of my friend, and I feel like I have her with me when I cook.
That's a sad and emotional story, but also about how people live in their recipes. My mother was, a couple of years ago, was at a memorial service for somebody she knew who'd passed away, and the memorial service program included a number of recipes that woman that somehow summed up something about her. It was really striking.
I wonder, in closing, if you have some thoughts for us on projects that are ongoing. I know you said Harvard. I know DU is collecting these cookbooks, and this is ongoing work for us to collect this family history and to have it personally. Do you have some insight for us on, is it good to write it down, to digitize, to kind of what can we do with these cookbooks? I know just thinking about it has changed our frame of thinking.
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know that I have good advice about what we should do on the digital question, which was raised, which I think is a really good one. I don't have an answer to that. I guess the first thing I would say is just to think about these cookbooks as more than just cookbooks, in a sense. So, I mean, that's to say, whether you decide what you want to do with your cookbooks. I mean, I agree, this is a challenge for everyone. What do we want to do with any of our stuff? What do we want to do with these things? Is just to not think of them simply in terms of, do I use it or not? But to think, what does it mean to me? What sorts of stories, what emotions does it evoke in me? What kinds of histories are embedded in that cookbook? And so if you decide you want to have, if there's something that feels meaningful to you and that you want to keep, I guess what I want to say is feel empowered to keep it, even if you never cook from it. Don't regard them as purely utilitarian objects, but as things that tell something about your history or potentially about the history of your family. And that can be a reason for keeping something. I mean, it can also be a reason that you think, okay, it's about my family and that's fine. I don't want to keep it. I don't mean to say you have to keep everything that has to do with your family, but simply to widen out the sense of what a cookbook is, I guess. And to say that these things are important and our daily lives are important, and the lives of those women who cooked things in the past for us or for other people, their lives were meaningful, and the accoutrements of their lives are also important to history. I guess that's what I want to end with saying, is to think that that's history too. And we do a disservice to the past if we think history is only about stuff that has to do with other people or outside of the domestic space. So yeah, anyway, that's what I would like to say. But mostly just, it was lovely meeting you, and thank you all for the very interesting things you had to say and for the opportunity to talk about cookbooks. And I wish you really all the best for the rest of your day.